Saudi Arabia. Control over Islam's two holiest cities and a quarter of the earth's oil gave the House of Saud vast influence in the Islamic world. The kingdom's official religion formed the ideological underpinning of bin Laden's jihad movement: anti-Western, anti-modern, anti-female.
Wahhabism is about as typical of Islam as the Ku Klux Klan is of Christianity. And does that make my point? It's an extremist, radical, violent version of Islam.
Well, that's another part of that Muslim world that's got to change, but we need the Muslim world to work with us on this, to rid themselves of these Islamic idealists, these fanatics that understand the Quran, that they can go out and kill innocent people. And so this takes education. This is going to take a time, but certainly we can win and take the nation states out of action that are continue to support terrorism.
Iran, birthplace of modern political Islam. The mullahs seized power in a wave of religious fury in 1979. They built a terrorist movement in Lebanon that killed 241 U.S. Marines. They orchestrated the Kobar Towers bombing and scores of other outrages. They built the cult of the suicide bomber.
Islamic revolution in Iran actually started the Islamism, which is Islamic terrorism.
Manda Ervin heads up the International Alliance of Iranian Women.
By starting Death to America slogan, by taking over the U.S. Embassy, they proved to the terrorist groups in the Muslim world that America is vulnerable, that America could be defeated, and that's what Khomeini did. That's what the Islamic revolution in Iran did. They opened the door to anti-American outright terrorism.
I think it would be most unwise to attack Iran. The reason is not that Iran is innocent on weapons of mass destruction or ties to terrorist groups. It has both in spades. The students, the young people, the women, the reformers, and even a large part of the Iranian clerics are opposed to this crazy regime in Tehran. Under those circumstances, we don't want to drive all these wonderful reformers and women and students into the arms of these crazy mullahs by using military force.
Syria, a nation of 17 million ruled for decades by a corrupt Ba'athist dictatorship. Partners in the Iranian terror syndicate. Open sponsors of terrorist camps in the Bekaa Valley.
After September 11th, there was this notion that you had an enemy, and it wasn't just terror. It was two people, two entities. They were Islamic fundamentalists who did have a rogue nation like Iran and like Afghanistan, and they were autocratic fascist governments who either worked in concert with them or stealthily gave them monies and technical support, like Syria, like people in Lebanon, and like Iraq.
And Iraq, bordering each of the other three. For 35 years, the playground of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party dictatorship. Hussein was the most ruthless leader in a ruthless corner of the world, launching 2 wars against his neighbors, openly funding terror groups. His nation was a safe house for the world's most wanted terror leaders.
The Saudis, who are not our friends in my view, started to remove al-Qaeda people from their soil after 9/11. They thought, okay, less of this. The Pakistanis disowned, after a bit of an interval, the Taliban and put al-Qaeda on a prescribed list. These were regimes that had been flirting with it before, but they were not going to be caught flirting with it afterwards, for excellent reasons of state of their own. Saddam Hussein invites Mr. Zarqawi to come from Afghanistan to Iraq after 9/11. This is the act of a very irrational person. He must know These are not the acts of someone who's interested in survival and self-preservation.
The Iraqi people were impoverished by more than a decade of international sanctions, while Saddam Hussein played an endless game of hide-and-seek with United Nations weapons inspectors. Tim Trevan is an Australian scientist who served on those UN inspection teams.
A system of carrots and sticks were put in place to cajole Saddam into doing the international community's will. The carrot was, if he complied, oil sanctions would be lifted, and the stick was, if he didn't, sanctions would remain in place and potentially there'd be further military action. The trouble is, over time, it became evident that the carrot wasn't enough to make Saddam to comply. He didn't need to get rid of sanctions. He actually was probably empowered by the sanctions being in place. And over time, the military stick became less and less viable given the slow deterioration of the unanimity in the Security Council on how to deal with Iraq. So yes, I think the 9/11 events did require a revisiting of how to deal with this situation.
British and American planes patrolled the skies over northern and southern Iraq throughout the 90s, protecting the country's Kurdish and Shia minorities from the full weight of Saddam's cruelty.
We want to seriously diminish the threat posed by Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program.
Clinton said there was weapons of mass destruction without a congressional approval, never went to the Congress, he never went to the UN. He bombed in December 1998. We don't know whether he hit any weapons of mass destruction. The no-fly zones were up to 350,000 sorties. They were unsustainable. One day American and British pilots don't fly, then people in Kurdistan are going to be massacred. Every creepy person like Abu Abbas or Abu Nadal and al-Qaeda were in Kurdistan, and after 9/11 that was intolerable.
Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants.
The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Mr. George W. Bush, President of the United States of America.
On September 12, 2002, George Bush stood before the United Nations and declared that the end was coming in the 11-year showdown with Iraq. The pre-9/11 dance over weapons inspections had to end. The no-fly zones had to end. Saddam's persecution of his own people had to end. This was the new voice of American conservatism. Iraq would be the great experiment, the land where democratic, humane values would be allowed to triumph in a region that had known only tyranny.
Last year, the UN Commission on Human Rights found that Iraq continues to commit extremely grave violations of human rights and that the regime's repression is all-pervasive.
The first necessity was obviously to take out the people who had committed the first aggression, the first atrocity. Once that was done, and the Taliban removed from power and the al-Qaeda as far as possible punished and scattered and dispersed, the question was, now what are we going to do about the next one? In order to confront the next one, one had, in my opinion, to remove the keystone state that was the encourager of jihadist rhetoric, which Iraq had become very loudly, and thus to influence directly and indirectly the politics of Iran, the center of the Shiite extremists, and of Saudi Arabia, the center of the Wahhabi ones. Show them first what could happen, and second, alter the balance of power on their borders. There is no pardon to be offered even to regimes that flirt with this.